हाँ जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
वालेकुम सलाम।
Bismillah, let's begin. So let me tell you what my plan for today is. फिर इंशाल्लाह हम शुरू करते हैं. As I stated in my message in the morning, inshallah, today we are planning to do speciation, which is basically the extension of the same idea that we have been doing so far. ठीक है, तो मैं जल्दी से I will give you a bird's eye view of what we have been talking about, so that inshallah we can build on that and proceed what I've basically planned to do today. ठीक है जी? Okay. Just give me 1 second, please. Okay. और फिर मेरी आज कोशिश है स्पीसीशन के अलावा आर्टिफिशियल सिलेक्शन वाला टॉपिक भी हम अगर कर लें तो क्या ही अच्छी बात होगी. वैसे भी आज तो आप बहुत एक्साइटेड हैं क्योंकि स्कूल्स बंद होने की न्यूज़ आपको मिल गई होगी. तो स्कूल की तरफ से अपडेट आई है राबिया आपको अभी तक? एलजीएस वालों ने कुछ अपडेट दिया हो कि एग्जाम्स का क्या सीन है या फिर क्या सिलसिला है?
सर अभी का तो नहीं पता, लेकिन पहले सुनने में आया था कि वो फर्स्ट से एग्जाम्स रख रहे हैं, जो कि बहुत
बट
अर्ली था. लेकिन
यस,
अब जब न्यूज़ आई उसके बाद उन्होंने कुछ अपडेट नहीं दी.
साइकेस डीएचए ने तो अपडेट दे दिया. दे आर पोस्टपोनिंग द एग्जाम्स आफ्टर द स्कूल रीओपन्स. लेकिन पता नहीं बाकी स्कूल्स क्या. असल में ऑनलाइन एग्जाम लेने के लिए तो कोई भी तैयार नहीं होगा बिकॉज दैट्स अ वेरी वियर्ड आइडिया. And of course, in only 2 days, you don't expect people to take exams. Okay, so I mean, the only option that we're left is कि ये दिसंबर का एग्जाम महीना जो आप एग्जाम्स में जाते होते थे वो 23rd तक 24th तक टीचिंग चलेगी और फिर उसके बाद कुछ सिलसिला होगा. और whatever the case is, let's see what happens. चलें जी. So I am going to begin. So let me write the name of the topic that we're doing today: speciation. Okay जी. अच्छा जी. So now let me begin with the idea. अगर आपको याद हो मैंने आपको बताया था कि इस टॉपिक में we are going to look at 3 levels basically. We will see how variation happens, and in variation we talked about the idea of discontinuous variation and we talked about the idea of continuous variation. Okay. उसके बाद and of course all of the stuff that it had with it. उसके बाद we went on to look at the idea of natural selection. ठीक है. Or is natural selection, and of course after variation what follows is natural selection. Or natural selection where we saw ideas like some alleles being advantageous, for example. और एक key phrase था इसमें, and that key phrase was some organisms better adapted to the environment. Better adapted to the environment. ठीक है. इसको आप advantageous allele भी कह सकते हैं. मैंने आपको कहा था कि ये वाला phrase जो second phrase है, some organisms are better adapted to the environment, ये भी ठीक है. इसके अलावा selective advantage भी ठीक है. ये तीनों ठीक हैं. लेकिन बहरहाल the word, the sentence that depicts the idea to its best possible way is organisms are better adapted to the environment. ठीक है. और फिर हमने eventually देखा था कि this will lead to what is known as speciation, which is basically evolution. और इसी आइडिया को बेसिकली आज हम एक्सटेंड करते हुए अपनी बात को आगे करेंगे. ओके, दैट व्हाट यानी कि स्पीसिएशन का लिटरल जो मीनिंग है, व्हाट स्पीसिएशन बेसिकली मींस is the idea that species, they basically change from one species to the other. That is basically what they talk about evolution is all about. So speciation का basically मतलब है means of formation of new species. And if I were to bracket this, means of formation species. ठीक है, और इसी आइडिया पे आज इंशाल्लाह we will talk further. Okay. So up which there are some terms that I want to introduce first. Okay, I'm going to jot them down on the right side of the board, and then बल्कि इधर नीचे लिख लेते हैं और फिर इंशाल्लाह हम अपनी बात को आगे करेंगे, because I need to be very clear about some vocabulary, and if that is not clear, then I mean it will be difficult for me. So the ideas are very simple. The first term that I am going to talk about is known as, ये सबको पता है, population. I mean ये back in ecology, sorry. Population का मतलब basically क्या है, is a group of individuals of a species. Okay, so a group of individuals of a species. यानी कि पाकिस्तान में ह्यूमंस की पॉपुलेशन फॉर एग्जांपल इतनी है, डॉग्स की पॉपुलेशन फॉर एग्जांपल इतनी है, कैट्स की पॉपुलेशन फॉर एग्जांपल इतनी है. दिस इज समथिंग बेसिकली दैट वी कैन डू. ऑलराइट, इसी का एक्सटेंडेड आइडिया है which is known as gene population. Okay, यानी कि basically not gene population, population, ये जो मैं आपको चीजें बता रहा हूँ, population genetics, you won't find these in the exam के इनको define करें, लेकिन इनको समझना थोड़ा सा जरूरी है if you need to make complete sense of what the topic is all about. So population genetics is basically the study of genes in a population, study of genes in population. और इसी से वो word निकला है, it's from this branch that we have the following word that is of concern for us, and that is the gene pool. Levels में ये I think I talked about this. A gene pool is that abstract idea. आप basically समझें कि gene pool is a collection of, यानी कि आप समझें it's an abstract idea which basically means, यानी कि देखें एक population में हमें genes नजर तो नहीं आ रही ना, लेकिन a collection of all genes of all organisms is basically called as gene pool. ठीक है, और अगर हम gene pool की बात करें, now strictly talking in terms of genetics, you know that when we are talking about gene pools, we are basically जब हम all genes की बात करते हैं, इसका मतलब है all alleles. And if you remember the definition of alleles, उसका मतलब है allele is a different form of a gene. ठीक है, और अगर हम सिंपली बात करें तो हमें पता है कि alleles जो हैं वो dominant भी होती हैं और allele recessive भी होती हैं. That is what makes a gene an allele. That's what the alternative form is all about. Okay. और अगर हम एक single trait बात करें, for example, capital R, small r, I mean that's basically how this thing looks like. So that gives us the basically जो मैं आपको terms देना चाह रहा हूँ, मैं और लिख रहा हूँ. The next thing is allele frequency. Allele frequency, what does the word allele frequency mean? It's very simple. Frequency आप समझें is basically the occurrence. यानी कि what is the percentage, not percentage, what is the occurrence, if you like, of a particular allele in a particular population, for example. That is basically what we mean when we say allele. Now, I will throw a question, and I want you to think about this. Do you think over a very large period of time, if we consider what is known as evolution and natural selection, do you think that the allele frequency should remain the same, or do you think that the allele frequency should differ? Let me give you an example. Let me make my question more clearer, if you like. मैं suppose करता हूँ, hypothetically speaking, जो total number of alleles हैं, they are 100, for example. And let's suppose there are 84 capital, हम hypothetically suppose कर रहे हैं कि पूरे gene pool में एक यही एलील है। या चलें हम एक एलील की बात करें, 84 डोमिनेंट हैं और 84 में से 100 में से माइनस करें 16 जो है वो रिसेसिव है। Now this number is telling us the allele frequency. Okay. Now the question that we need, the thing that we need to think about is, why are we talking about these terminologies? It is because in natural selection, now that's a question, Rabia, you have to think about it then answer. Um, in a in a in a given time, agar hum baat kar rahe hain, for example, let's consider natural selection happens the way we understood in our previous lesson. Okay, do you think that over the period of that large span of time, the allele frequency will remain the same, or do you think it will differ?
It will differ.
Exactly. यानी कि the reason why advantageous characteristics are being preserved is because वही genes pass on हो रही हैं, and of course their number varies. Okay, so this is I'm basically setting the context for speciation. Or yeah, basically when I use the words like gene pool, like allele frequency, so we should be comfortable with these words. इनकी कभी भी वो definitions नहीं पूछता. Lekin since these terms are used, we need to ensure that we understand them in a very good manner. Okay. All right. So now I am going to jump on to what is known as speciation. So coming back, हमारा जो आज lesson है वो basically इस idea के इर्द गिर्द घूमेगा. So let's start from here. Speciation. Okay, now as I said, speciation is a means of forming new species. लेकिन उसके लिए, so let me write that down here. It's a means of forming new species. लेकिन उससे पहले we need to, since we're talking about a lot of terminologies, we need to come up with a proper definition of species. Okay, now I'm going to give you a mark scheme definition of species. इसको लिख लें एक, और मैं इसको आपको bullet points में दूंगा because we need to understand what are the keywords that we need to use. So species is a group of organisms that have similar group of organisms with similar, three things are similar, should be similar. Number one, what is known as their morphology. Morphology, if I explain that in very crude words, is basically the structural aspect, okay? And then physiology, yani ki physiologically they should be similar physiologically. And biochemical features, biochemical features, ठीक है, जो biochemical pathways हैं like respiration and all, they should be similar. So that is one aspect of this definition. Yani a group of organisms with similar morphological morphological has to do with the structure, physiological has to do with the function, or biochemical is, of course, that's obviously understood. ये definition की important बात नहीं है. जो important बात है, that's the second bullet point that I'm writing, and that is they are capable of reproducing fertile offsprings. Capable of producing fertile offsprings. So that is basically what this definition is all about. अच्छा जी, now इस idea को हम ये जो excuse me excuse me, इस second point को I will talk about the second point. You know, यानी कि what follows from this definition is कि if we have a different species, यानी कि हमारे पास two different species हैं, for example. So two different species should be what is known as reproductively isolated. Reproductively isolated. This is a key word. और इस कीवर्ड का क्या मतलब है वो मैं आपको बताता हूँ. Reproductive isolation का मतलब is basically, now let me, if you like, define what reproductive isolation is. It basically consists of mechanisms that prevent gene flow. Gene flow prevention का मतलब है यानी कि gene flow between species. ठीक है, यानी कि no genes will be passed on from this species to the other species. यानी कि they reproductively isolate होने का मतलब is not necessarily just it means the inability to mate. No, it means even if two species, and we look at that example, mule is a classical example. If a female horse is mated with a male donkey, what is produced is a mule. लेकिन आप कह सकते हैं वो that is reproduction. Well, that is reproduction, but the mule is sterile. So that fits the definition of what is known as reproductively isolated. Okay. So हम species की definition से basically ये चीज देख रहे हैं. We're trying to see. As I said, let me summarize. So we talked about the definition of species, and I said the first thing that we need to understand about the definition is that they have similar morphological, physiological, and biochemical features. Number two, they're capable of producing fertile offsprings. Okay. और फिर मैंने कहा था कि इसका जो logical conclusion है वो ये है. So let me write that down here so that we don't get confused. The logical conclusion will be that agar we are talking about two different species, then these two different species will be reproductively isolated. And the reason I brought this up is because, again, that's a key word that we need to know what that means. Acha ji. Now, the next thing that we are going to understand is an extension of the same idea, which is reproductive isolation. Okay. मैंने आपको कहा कि they consist of mechanisms. So we need to understand what those mechanisms are that basically prevent the gene flow between the species. Or, we can say that there are a number of barriers that have been evolved which bring about reproductive isolation. So, there are two categories basically. Barriers that lead to reproductive isolation. There are two of them. So I'm going to bubble this and I'm going to mention this the way I usually do, and that is the following. There are two types of barriers that will eventually lead to reproductive isolation. पहले वाले को हम कहते हैं, it's very simple, pre-zygotic mechanisms, okay? And as you can see from the word, it's quite obvious, but I'll explain it. And then again, it's post-zygotic mechanisms. Okay. Yes. So what that means is pre-zygotic का मतलब है कि these mechanisms even prevent the formation of zygote. ठीक है? Let me box that out. Let me box this out also. जो pre-zygotic है, that is before zygotic. यानी कि there are barriers which prevent zygote from being formed in the first place. Okay. They may happen before or after mating. We'll see about the categories. And then you have post-zygotic mechanisms, which basically prevent the hybrids from passing on their genes. Or hybrid basically word हम use कर रहे हैं. अगर if two different species, they are able to breed and they are able to produce an offspring, that offspring will be sterile, or basically usko hybrid कहते हैं. That's known as the hybrid. And that's basically, it prevents hybrids from passing on their genes to their offsprings and so on and so forth. They don't have their offspring in the first place. We will look at the example of the mule just in a minute. Acha ji, now considering pre-zygotic mechanisms, there are 4 pre-zygotic mechanisms that we need to understand, and the ideas are very simple. They're not very difficult to understand. Okay, so let's talk about those 4 of them. The first one is known as ecological isolation. Okay, the idea is very simple. you have different habitats, या यानी कि for example जो we have different habitats, we have different seasons. Like for example, some animals would mate in some seasons and some would mate in some seasons. So that is one way in which we are preventing the zygote from being formed in the first place. We are preventing fertilization to happen in the first place. So that is known as ecological isolation, which is basically clear from the word ecological, which means that populations breed in different habitats within the same general area. Okay, and you have different habitats. It's not, it's ecological isolation. Okay. Number two is behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation. इसका क्या मतलब है? This basically means animals, they have evolved different courtship methods, different courtship or mating methods slash mating methods. So every species, if you like, has their own behavior when it comes to the courtship or mating methods. So again, that is also one of the ways which prevents the zygote from being formed in the first place. Okay? Again, don't lose track of the big picture. We are trying to understand ये reproductive isolation किस तरह हो रही है दो species के बीच में, which means why aren't they unable to transfer genes between them? Because number one, either they cannot form the zygote in the first place, और उनकी भी क्या categories है वो हम देख रहे हैं, and then we talk about the post-zygotic just a second. Okay. The third category is mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation, ठीक है जी, which simply means that this is due to the incompatibility of the sexual organs to have the ability to mate. Okay, incompatibility, and of course it is due to evolution. Incompatibility of sexual organs. Yani, again, the idea is the same. The zygote is being prevented to be formed in the first place. And then number four, the fourth category is gametic isolation, इसको कहते हैं, which means, और ये इसकी plants पे कुछ example है. Let me just write it down first and then explain. That means that there is incompatibility of pollen and sigma in flowering plants, for example, और या फिर inability of the male and the female gametes. यानी कि gametes बन जाते हैं, mating भी हो जाती है, लेकिन the gametes are unable to fuse. ठीक है? So all of these four, ecological isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation, are ways of pre-zygotic mechanisms that serve as a barrier and that basically prevent animals from reproducing, which is basically the extended idea of what we're talking about, and that is reproductively isolate. अच्छा, post-zygotic भी बहुत interesting है. Post-zygotic की 3 categories हैं. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. The first category is hybrid inviability. Again, of course, if it's post-zygotic, what naturally follows, hybrid inviability. What naturally follows is that a zygote is formed but it fails to develop. Zygote formed, लेकिन वो inviable है but failed to develop. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is hybrid sterility. Hybrid. This is a classical example of यानी कि reproduction हो गई, offspring हो गया, but that offspring is sterile. It can't produce offspring. Okay. And then you have hybrid breakdown. What is hybrid breakdown? यानी कि as you proceed, successive generations जो हैं, as you go down the generations, uh, they have increasingly lowered fertility. Successive generations show increasingly लो fertility और eventually एक point आता है कि उनकी fertility बिल्कुल zero हो जाती है and eventually they are selected out of the population. Okay, so that is basically these are the methods, if you like, which are contributing to reproductive isolation. यानी कि to summarize, reproductive isolation का मतलब है organisms are unable to produce offsprings that can produce fertile offspring. Yani कि they can made to produce fertile offspring. And then again, you have two categories, pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. Pre-zygotic mein the zygote is not going to be formed in the first place. Post-zygotic mein ऑस्प्रिंग बन जाता है लेकिन देयर आर अदर ऑप्शंस लाइक एक में गेमीट बन गया और वो गेमीट ही आगे फॉर्म नहीं हुआ and you have hybrid sterility, which is the hybrid is unable to produce fertile offsprings, it's a mule. And then hybrid breakdown is successively as we go down F1, F2, F3, F4. जैसे जैसे we are going down the generations, the fertility it decreases. ठीक है जी. So that is basically the idea of speciation and reproductive isolation. और मैंने आपको examples दे दिए pre-zygotic and post-zygotic isolating methods की. Okay, are we good so far?
Yes, sir.
जबरदस्त. चलिए जी, अब अगला idea again is very simple and very interesting, and that is basically टाइप्स ऑफ स्पीसिएशन. यानी कि स्पीसिएशन जो है अभी तो हमने आइडिया देख लिया ना कि रिप्रोडक्टिव आइसोलेशन, लेकिन कमिंग बैक टू द आइडिया ऑफ स्पीसिएशन, what are the types of speciation? Okay, so there are two types of speciations. Speciation, there are two categories. Number one, what is known as allopatric speciation. नाम थोड़े अजीब से हैं, but trust me, the ideas are very simple. And the other is known as sympatric speciation. So now let's look at both of them one by one. You know, the evolution of most species is thought to have taken place as a result of what is known as, so मैं यहाँ पे heading देता हूँ, we're first talking about allopatric. Okay, now before I explain what allopatric speciation is, we need to understand a very important keyword, and that is geographical isolation. But I think ये बहुत simple सा word है. It is self-explanatory what geographical isolation means. Okay, geographical isolation is when two populations once. Okay, let me write that down for you. When two populations of one species is thought to have taken place when two populations of one species, sorry, क्या लिख रहा हूँ मैं, when two populations of one species come to occupy two different environments. Sorry, when two populations of one species come to occupy two different environments. ठीक है जी. यानी कि let me give you a very basic and a very simple example. यानी कि geographical isolation का मतलब है कि separation हो रही है basically, और वो separation किसी भी चीज की वजह से हो सकती है. वो separation एक mountain की वजह से भी हो सकती है. पहाड़ की एक तरफ एक एरिया था, दूसरी तरफ दूसरा एरिया था, एक पहाड़ बन गया, and then they got separated. I'll talk about that in detail. यानी कि it can be basically any physical barrier. It can be number one, a mountain, या फिर it can be what is known as a river. ठीक है, या फिर I mean anything. और आपको पता है कि for example, let's suppose कि if there was this mountain, or if they have been separated with a high terrain and a low terrain, तो आपको पता है कि the environment here will be very different from the environment that is here. So these areas will experience what is known as different selection pressures. यानी कि हो सकता है कि ऊपर वाले एरिया पे एक्सट्रीम कोल्ड हो, नीचे वाले एरिया पे एक्सट्रीम हॉट हो, and basically so and so forth. So I mean, to give you an idea what allopatric speciation is, it is a speciation. It is speciation, which is change of species resulting from geographical separation of populations. Okay, let me write that down here for you. So allopatric speciation को अगर हम define करें, it will be speciation, which is of course change in species. Speciation uh, resulting from geographical separation of populations. It's called allopatric speciation. ठीक है जी, और इंशाल्लाह इसके में अभी आपको क्वेश्चंस मैंने रखे हैं, मैं आपको दिखाता हूं, तो आगे आपको केस स्टडीज में दिखा के आपको बताएगा, एंड यू विल अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट दैट मींस. सो दैट इज द फर्स्ट कैटेगरी ऑफ स्पीसीएशन. Sympatric speciation. Sympatric का जो पहला वर्ड का पोजीशन है, इसका बेसिकली मतलब होता है the same. I mean, sympatric यानी कि let me define this first, फिर मैं explain बताऊंगा. Sympatric speciation occurs when two or more species are formed from a single let me write it down. When two or more species are formed from a single ancestral species. Each occupying the same geographical location, and that's the key point. Each occupying same geographical region. Now let's try and give this idea a slight contrast. Okay, क्या मतलब? I mean, allopathic में तो समझ में आ गई, एक physical barrier ने काफी time period के लिए it separated the two areas. We had different selection pressures, and as a result, the species evolved into different species, and that resulted in speciation. Sympatric में एक ही जगह पे रह के species change हो रहे हैं. So I mean, the selection pressures that both experience are the same because it's the same geographical location. So how can we reason why does this happen? The answer to this is what is known as polyploidy. ये polyploidy क्या चीज है? The idea is very simple. Basically, genes में कुछ गड़बड़ होती है, which eventually gives rise to a new species, as they say. Okay. Now let me explain what polyploid organisms are. Polyploid, ये काफी सारी definitions मैं आपको इसलिए दे रहा हूँ because बच्चों को जब तक definitions ना दें, revision करते हुए उनको समझ नहीं आती. There are very less cases in the exam where he has asked you definitions. But since these are concepts that we need to understand, so when you are revising, these definitions will definitely help you. So polyploid are organisms with more than two complete sets of chromosomes. With more than two complete set of chromosomes. यानी कि क्या मतलब? यानी कि ये मतलब फॉर एग्जांपल ह्यूमन में 46 है, तो 46 का डबल आप कर लें. ओके, आई मीन दैट इज अ रेयर कंडीशन ऑफ पोलीप्लॉइडी. और अगर हम उसको डिप्लॉइड हैप्लॉइड के नंबर के हिसाब से रिप्रेजेंट करें, पोलीप्लॉइडी का क्या मतलब है? पोलीप्लॉइडी का ये मतलब है आइदर दे कैन हैव 3n और दे कैन हैव 4n एंड सो एंड सो फोर्थ. ओके, और ये जो 3n है, इसके लिए हम जो सॉरी 4n है, इसके लिए हम वर्ड यूज करते हैं टेट्राप्लॉइड. टेट्राप्लॉइड, ऑफ कोर्स टेट्रा कमिंग फ्रॉम, यानी कि टेट्राप्लॉइड का क्या मतलब है? लिटरली 4 सेट्स ऑफ क्रोमोसोम. ओके, सो दीज आर ये बेसिकली polyploidy will result because of a problem during meiosis. Okay, of course we don't need to go into that details, but बेसिकली होता क्या है? पोलीप्लॉइड अगर फर्ज करें किसी भी एक ऑर्गेनिज्म में कोई भी स्पॉन्टेनियस मियोसिस में मसला आ गया, सो व्हेन अ पोलीप्लॉइड individual or an organism will be mated or crossed with an original diploid जो कि उस particular population में है. So a polyploid with the original diploid will often result in a sterile offspring. ठीक है, जिसका क्या मतलब है कि स्टेरल ऑफस्प्रिंग है, तो इस स्टेरल ऑफस्प्रिंग की नॉर्मल के साथ रिप्रोडक्टिव आइसोलेशन होगी, which of course is a tool and a means for evolution at the end of the day, as they say. ठीक है, so this is basically what natural selection का extended idea about speciation was all about. So let me quickly summarize before I go for a very small break. आज मैंने जरा खींच दिया उसको 40 minutes तक, लेकिन फिर इसका हम question देखते हैं इंशाल्लाह. So speciation, I basically began my class to summarize with the idea that we start from variation, which leads to natural selection, and which eventually leads to what is known as speciation. ठीक है, फिर I introduced you to, excuse me, I introduced you to some of terminologies like gene pool, like allele frequency, और अब आप मुझे बताएं कि allopatric or sympatric speciation के बाद now you understand that the allele frequency will change. Okay, तो अगर हम पहले से ही पता करना शुरू कर, पहले से किसी तरह पता लगा लें कि एलील फ्रीक्वेंसी चेंज हो रही है, तो हमें पहले से शायद पता लग जाए कि एवोल्यूशन होने वाली है. वेल, उसके लिए एक मैथमेटिकल डेरिवेशन है, हार्डी-वेइनबर्ग थ्योरम, दैट आई एम नॉट गोइंग टू टॉक अबाउट टुडे, बट इंशाल्लाह इट इज इंक्लूडेड इन दिस टॉपिक. एंड देन वी वेंट ऑन टू लुक एट द डेफिनेशन ऑफ स्पीशीज, in which we said it has two basic things, और फिर मैंने reproductive isolation का एक आपको idea बताया है, and barriers that lead to this in terms of pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. Okay, and then you have uh, finally speciation, which has its two types known as allopatric and sympatric. अच्छा जी, यहाँ पे हम अपनी 1 मिनट की ब्रेक पे जाते हैं before I jump to the. All right. बच्चों, अच्छा आई थॉट के कैन यू हियर मी? अच्छा, आई थॉट के सेशन खुद ही एंड हो गया. चलो, इसने मुझे आज एडिट नहीं दिया अभी तक. ओके, सो कैन यू हियर मी बोथ ऑफ यू?
यस सर.
अच्छा, मेरी आपसे एक रिक्वेस्ट है, मैंने आपको ये टॉपिक करवा दिया है, लेकिन द नेचर ऑफ दिस टॉपिक इज सच दैट अनलेस यू पिक अप योर पेंसिल एंड यू लिटरली गो थ्रू योर टेक्स्ट बुक वर्ड बाय वर्ड, आपको कम फायदा होगा. आपको यू हैव टू डू दिस. ओके, आई डोंट नो इफ यू आर फॉन्ड ऑफ गोइंग थ्रू द टेक्स्ट बुक्स, बट फॉर दिस टॉपिक यू विल हैव टू. चलिए जी, आई एम एंडिंग द सेशन. 1 मिनट के बाद रिज्यूम करते हैं, और फिर ये जो आज हमने पढ़ा है इसके पास पेपर्स के हम इंशाल्लाह क्वेश्चंस देख के एंड करते हैं. Thank you. Just take a break. We'll get a glass of water and then we'll resume.